Discipline has become a spectacle, something to be displayed, timed, tracked, made visible. In the modern world, it's a badge of control, of self-mastery, of the ego's ability to command the body like a machine. But beneath the glow of morning routines and curated productivity is a silence no one wants to acknowledge. Because eventually, something breaks. The system collapses, the rhythm falls apart, the willpower drains out, and no one knows why. You followed the steps, you kept the schedule, you stayed accountable, and yet it still failed. Carl Jung understood this collapse not as weakness but as exposure. What fails in those moments is not your resolve, but your illusion of coherence. You thought you were one thing, one mind, one will, but beneath that identity lies a stranger, unspoken, unacknowledged, buried under years of performance. You call it burnout, self-sabotage, lack of discipline. Jung called it the shadow. It is everything you couldn't be. Everything you weren't allowed to be, everything that got pushed out of the light because it didn't fit the image. It's not just the darkness you fear, it's the strength you abandoned, the anger you swallowed, the power you exiled, the truth you never learned how to carry. And it doesn't stay quiet. It waits, like a second self behind the mask, interfering not because it wants to destroy you, but because it was never integrated. You push forward, you grind, you optimize, until the structure can't hold, and suddenly the discipline collapses from within. Not because you weren't strong enough to stay consistent, but because part of you was never part of the plan. The ego builds a fortress of control, but the shadow was never invited. And what's uninvited doesn't disappear, it distorts. It acts in secret, it sabotages routines, erodes confidence, and pulls you under when you thought you were at your peak. This isn't a crisis of habits, it's a crisis of wholeness. Discipline, real discipline, the kind that holds under pressure, the kind that doesn't fracture when no one's watching, begins with a confrontation. Not with your schedule, but with your soul. Not with how hard you work, but with how much of yourself you've refused to meet. Until the unconscious becomes conscious, until the rejected becomes recognized, until the inner split is brought into dialogue, there can be no discipline, only performance and collapse, order and relapse, effort and erasure. This isn't a productivity video, it's a descent. Because before you can discipline the self, you have to find out who is actually in there. And most people have no idea. Discipline is one of the most admired illusions in the modern psyche. We imagine the self as a sovereign entity, capable of directing its future through sheer will, as if the human mind were a linear system, as if the only thing needed for change was a plan, a schedule, and enough motivation. We are taught to believe that success is a question of force, that focus, output, and clarity emerge naturally from control. But what happens when control fails? What happens when the structure collapses, even when all the steps were followed? Most people don't have a category for that kind of failure, so they internalize it as weakness. They assume they simply weren't disciplined enough, that their willpower broke down. But Jung saw something far more disturbing, not weakness, but contradiction. Not failure, but fracture. Beneath the ego, beneath the self we identify with, is a system far more complex than we're willing to admit, and it doesn't respond to command. The psyche isn't a soldier taking orders from the will, it's a constellation of competing drives, repressed instincts, emotional patterns, and unconscious defenses, many of which formed long before you ever decided who you wanted to become. You do not sit at the top of this system like a god. You occupy a small portion of it, and that portion is what Jung called the ego. It's useful, it's necessary, but it's not the whole of who you are. When the ego tries to discipline the entire psyche without understanding its depths, the result is not transformation, it's repression. You force your habits into place. You silence the part of you that resists. You override the exhaustion. You mute the inner doubt. And for a time, it works. You get results. You start to believe you've mastered yourself, but eventually the structure falters. Something cracks. You lose momentum. You lose clarity. You lose trust in yourself. This is where most people give up. They return to the search for the next system, the next hack, the next dopamine blueprint. But Jung would have stopped here, not to fix the routine, but to ask a deeper question. Who was it that resisted the structure? What voice within you refused the plan? Why did that resistance emerge now? And what has it been trying to say? Jung believed that what we call resistance is often a form of communication, a protest from within, and more often than not, that protest comes from the shadow, the part of ourselves that has been disowned, the part that doesn't fit the image, the part that learned long ago that it wasn't allowed to exist. We don't lose discipline because we're weak. We lose it because we're dishonest about what we're carrying. The shadow doesn't respond to pressure. It doesn't disappear through effort. In fact, the more you push, the more it retaliates. Because to the shadow, your discipline is not discipline. It's domination. The ego sets the plan. The shadow breaks it. The ego tracks the goal. The shadow questions the goal itself. The ego wants silence. The shadow wants a voice. And until that voice is heard, not conquered, not suppressed, but heard, your discipline will always rest on unstable ground. You can build the perfect structure and still collapse from within. You can do everything right and still feel the quiet urge to destroy it all. That's not a moral failure. That's a psychological fact. The self cannot be mastered by force, only by integration. And integration requires that you know who and what you are actually trying to discipline. Otherwise, you're not practicing self-control. You're practicing self-erasure. And eventually, something inside you will refuse to go any further. To understand why discipline fails, you first have to understand what the self is and what it isn't. The modern person talks about self-improvement, as if there's one stable entity that just needs fine-tuning. But for Jung, the self is not a unified thing by default. It is fragmented. It is layered. It is shaped as much by rejection as by expression. And the most powerful forces within it are often unconscious, not because they are unreachable, but because they were made invisible. That is where the shadow begins. The shadow isn't an idea, it's a psychological structure. It's what's left behind in the making of a socially acceptable self. It forms every time you say, "That's not me," and believe it. Every time you hide an emotion, suppress a desire, censor a thought, not because it's wrong, but because it doesn't fit the role. As children, we learn who we are, not by discovering ourselves, but by adapting to what we're allowed to be. A child raised in a home that punishes anger will push that anger out of awareness. A child raised around fragile adults will disown their sadness to avoid being a burden. These acts of self-abandonment are invisible at the time, but they accumulate. And the person you become is not the full self. It's what survived. This is the ego. It forms as a necessary fiction, a pattern of attitudes, preferences, roles, and reactions that allow you to function in a social world. But the ego is not the full psyche. It's a filter, a mask. And behind that mask lies everything it had to cut away. Not erased, not destroyed, just buried, repressed, forgotten. The shadow is composed of that forgotten material, the cast-offs of identity. It isn't just made of darkness. That's a shallow misunderstanding. It contains all sorts of traits, some socially unacceptable, yes, but others simply incompatible with who you were trying to be. Confidence, erotic desire, creative fire, inner wildness. The shadow contains not only shame, but power. And this is what makes it dangerous to ignore. You don't just lose access to the parts of you that hurt, you lose access to the parts of you that could set you free. And the shadow doesn't stay buried. Jung knew that what the ego represses doesn't become harmless. It becomes autonomous. It acts through dreams, through slips of the tongue, through irrational emotions, through sudden moods, compulsive reactions, intense attractions and repulsions. You think you're moving through the world as one self. You are not. You are reacting through parts of yourself you haven't yet met. And the more tightly you cling to control, the more violently those parts try to speak. You lash out when someone confronts you with a trait you've disowned. You sabotage your own progress at the edge of breakthrough. You feel numb in moments that should matter. The shadow leaks into everything, especially when you're trying to appear focused, successful, driven. Because anything that distorts the image, anything that threatens the role, gets pushed down again, and the cycle deepens. Most people go their entire lives thinking they are their ego. They don't realize that the traits they hate in others, the habits they can't shake, the emotions they struggle to name, these are not flaws to correct, but clues. The shadow speaks constantly. The tragedy is that almost no one listens. Jung's great insight wasn't just that the shadow exists, but that your relationship with it determines everything. He believed that integration, the process of bringing unconscious material into conscious awareness, was not optional. It was necessary for psychological health. Not because the shadow is evil, but because when it remains unconscious, it acts without your permission. And the more unaware you are of it, the more power it holds over you. You don't choose whether or not to have a shadow. You choose whether or not to know it. And if you don't know it, it will shape your life anyway, through resistance, through repetition, through projection. That quiet resentment you feel toward people who seem too confident, too emotional, too intense, that's a projection. The very thing you're avoiding in yourself becomes the thing you see everywhere else. And so the shadow doesn't just distort your inner world, it corrupts your perception of others. You start to fight people for the traits you've never owned in yourself. And what does all this have to do with discipline? Everything. Because the part of you that resists discipline is not always lazy or afraid. Sometimes it's the part of you that has never been given a voice, the part that refuses to be suppressed again. And when you try to force control without first making contact with what you've suppressed, your effort collapses under its own weight. You can't force your psyche into coherence. You have to earn it. Through contact. Through recognition. Through a relationship with the shadow that is not based on fear, but on listening. That's where the real work begins. You build a system, you structure your days, you map the routines. You tell yourself this time it will hold, this time you'll stay consistent. And for a while, it works. You feel sharp, focused, controlled. The world makes sense again. The old patterns seem distant. You imagine yourself transformed. But then, something shifts. The structure begins to bend. You lose focus. The energy disappears. The habits unravel. You start making excuses, breaking promises, sabotaging what you said you wanted, and you don't know why. Most people call this a lack of discipline. They look for more motivation, more frictionless routines, more accountability tools. They assume the ego simply failed to execute. But for Jung, what's happening here is far more serious. and far more honest. The shadow has begun to speak. Because what you tried to organize wasn't just your calendar. You were trying to organize your psyche. You were trying to impose order on a system that is not built from logic, but from memory, repression, instinct, and contradiction. You tried to discipline a divided self without first confronting the division. And that division has a voice. It shows up in the form of resistance that doesn't make sense. The part of you that loses energy when it shouldn't, that forgets what mattered, that watches you ruin something just to feel real again. That part isn't irrational. It's exiled. And it's acting out because you've ignored it. Because your discipline left no room for conflict, no room for contradiction, no room for grief. This is how the shadow breaks the system. Not by accident, not through failure, but through opposition. Not to stop your growth, but to expose its falseness. To reveal the parts of you that were never part of the plan, and yet never left. That's why the breakdown feels so personal. It's not just your habits unraveling. It's your identity confronting something it can't absorb. The ego watches itself collapse and doesn't know what hit it. But the shadow knows. The shadow has always known. It knows that your goal is a mask for compensation, that your motivation is a distraction from fear, that your structure was built not on integration, but on the denial of what still haunts you. It knows that your need to be productive is rooted in shame, that your silence is not peace, but pressure, that your control is not strength, but a refusal to feel. And when you refuse to listen, it speaks in the only language it has left: sabotage. We tend to think of discipline as a matter of holding on, of clenching harder, narrowing our focus, removing all distractions until nothing exists but the task. We call that locking in. We treat it like a skill, a zone, a switch we flip. But for Jung, that kind of fixation is not clarity. It's neurosis. It's the ego in isolation, attempting to force the psyche into submission. And what looks like focus on the outside is often dissociation on the inside, a shutdown of the very parts of ourselves we'll inevitably need to finish what we started. To lock in the Jungian sense, is not to narrow, it's to unify. It's not the suppression of distraction, but the integration of inner division. To lock in is to align the self, not fragment it further. And that alignment doesn't begin with structure, it begins with listening. Because the shadow doesn't dissolve just because you're on schedule. The unmet parts of you don't heal just because you've built better habits. The unconscious doesn't care about your systems, it cares about contact. Until your discipline comes from dialogue, not domination, it will always remain fragile. It might look impressive, it might last for weeks, months even, but it will crack the moment the ego runs out of energy, because it was never supported by the rest of the self. It was built alone. Integration, in Jung's work, is the central task of psychological maturity. Not becoming perfect, not eliminating darkness, but learning how to bring the unconscious into relationship with the conscious mind. And this relationship is not symbolic or metaphorical, it's real. It happens in your reactions, in your choices, in your ability to recognize when your emotions aren't aligned with the image you're trying to project. It happens when you sit still, not to escape yourself, but to make contact with what's been buried. To integrate the shadow is to take what was once rejected and bring it into form. Not to let it take over, but to let it speak. And when it speaks, the system changes. Your energy doesn't just come from discipline anymore. It comes from within. It comes from a coherence between who you say you are and what you actually carry. And that coherence is the only state that holds under pressure. That's the real lock-in. Not obsession, not force, alignment. A state where the psyche is no longer fighting itself, no longer hiding from itself, no longer pretending to be less complex than it is. You don't just show up to work, you show up as one person. No mutiny beneath the surface, no split between the plan and the pain. You can move forward without dragging some hidden part of yourself behind you. This kind of discipline can't be faked. It doesn't come from optimizing your schedule. It comes from confronting the voices within you that were never given permission to speak. It comes from facing your shadow, not out of shame, but out of necessity, because you cannot lock in while part of you is still trying to get out. By now, the idea of integration should feel less like a metaphor and more like a demand. A psychological requirement for any self that wants to endure under pressure. But this is where most people retreat. They nod at the theory, quote the vocabulary, and then return to the cycle. Optimize, collapse, repeat. Because integration sounds good, but no one wants to face what it requires. And what it requires is contact with the parts of you that make you uncomfortable to remember. Jung's methods were not productivity tools. They weren't designed to make you more efficient or more stable in the eyes of others. They were meant to bring you into confrontation with your own unconscious, with the contents you repressed, projected, moralized, or simply denied because they didn't fit the story. And they were designed to do it in private, not as performance, not as therapy theater, but as a serious internal discipline. The primary method was what Jung called active imagination. It's not visualization, it's not meditation, it's not positive self-talk. It's sitting still, not to silence the mind, but to let the mind speak. You bring to consciousness a mood, a dream fragment, a strange image that won't let go of you, and instead of pushing it away, you enter into dialogue with it. You let it unfold. You ask it questions. You don't guide it. You follow it. You listen for what the unconscious is trying to say without censoring, without rushing in to explain. And at first it will feel strange. The ego is used to being the narrator. It doesn't want to listen. But if you can hold the tension, if you can resist turning the inner world into a narrative of control, the shadow will speak. Not always in words, sometimes in symbols, sometimes in tone, sometimes through unexpected memory, but it will speak. And when it does, your discipline will no longer be a solo performance. It will become a collaboration with the rest of you, the parts you buried, the parts you feared, the parts that never stopped living beneath your structure. This is not comfortable work. You will see things you don't want to see. You will recognize traits you tried to place in other people. You will feel the psychic cost of years spent pretending to be simpler than you are. But the work cannot begin until the unconscious is allowed to surface. And when it does, it doesn't just dissolve your illusions. It rebuilds the system from below. Because when the shadow is made conscious, it stops attacking. It becomes a force, a partner, a source of raw energy that no longer has to sabotage to be acknowledged. This is what most modern self-development misses completely. It promises you control without confrontation, productivity without dissent, a schedule without a soul. But Jung was clear. The path toward wholeness passes through the things you don't want to face. There is no shortcut. There is only you and what you've hidden. Shadow work is not a mood. It's not a wellness trend. It is a discipline in the truest sense, an ongoing commitment to making the unconscious conscious. Not to transcend the self, but to become a self you can actually stand behind. And the moment you begin to do this honestly, not for results, but for truth, everything begins to shift. Because the parts of you that once resisted your goals no longer need to. They've been invited in. And you're no longer a divided will, you're a unified one. A psyche in process, not conflict. That's how real change holds. That's how you stop breaking what you build. That's how you begin to lock in.
There's a point in this work where the question shifts. It's no longer, how do I stay consistent, or how do I stop sabotaging myself? These were necessary openings, honest questions from a divided psyche trying to hold itself together. But once you begin to make contact with the shadow, once you start to integrate the parts of yourself that were once invisible, the goal itself begins to change. It stops being about control, it becomes about coherence. Not how to appear focused, but how to become undivided. Not how to fix yourself, but how to become yourself. This is the point where Jung steps out of the frame of modern psychology entirely, because he wasn't trying to make people more productive. He wasn't trying to help them perform better within broken systems. He was trying to lead them into a confrontation with the self, not the ego, not the role, but the total psychic reality of who they are. He called this process individuation, not in the narcissistic sense of becoming unique, but in the existential sense of becoming whole. It is not self-help. It is not performance. It is the slow, painful, disorienting, lifelong work of integrating the fragmented psyche into a unified structure. And it demands everything. Because when you stop living through your ego, when you begin to confront the unconscious, to dialogue with the shadow, to recognize the roles you were forced to play, you don't just find new habits, you find a new center. A self that no longer exists to please others, or dominate the weak parts, or win the approval of some internalized figure of authority. You find a self that speaks from within and demands to be lived. This is the root of all lasting discipline. Not obedience, but authenticity. Not performance, but alignment. Because when you begin to live from the center of who you are, when your actions reflect not your shame, not your conditioning, but your wholeness, discipline is no longer forced. It becomes the natural expression of a self that is no longer at war with itself. But this path is hard. It requires you to give up the image, to drop the persona, to admit that the life you built was designed to protect you from parts of yourself you never understood. And when you let those defenses fall, the real work begins. Because now, you have to rebuild, not from ideals, but from fragments, from instincts, from truth. Jung never promised transcendence. He promised confrontation. And what lies on the other side is not a cleaner, sharper, more optimized you. It's a self you've never met before, but who has been waiting your entire life to be lived. That's the task. That's the discipline no one talks about. Not the discipline of will, but the discipline of becoming whole.